Welcome to Unit 2, The Media of Art. This is Lesson 4, The Principles of Design. This lesson will be introduced to the principles of design: repetition, rhythm, scale, proportion, contrast, emphasis, balance, variety, and unity. These principles give us an understanding of how artists work and how artists arrange them in order to communicate ideas. These terms can be used to analyze and describe anything from a realistic painting to a non-representational sculpture. The objectives for this lesson are to describe the role of design in the production and analysis of works of art, analyze the use of design principles to organize a work of art, examine the ability of certain design principles to direct the viewer's attention to details in a work of art, identify methods to create symmetrical, asymmetrical, and radial balance in a composition, distinguish scale and proportion in art, and demonstrate how design principles work together to engage the viewer. The outline for this lesson: unity and variety, balance, and their subcategories: symmetrical and asymmetrical balance, emphasis and subordination, directional forces, contrast, repetition and rhythm, scale and proportion, and we'll have a design summary at the end of the lesson. Your vocabulary is located here as well as on our Moodle page.
Our first image is from Charles Demuth. This is the figure 5 in gold from 1928. For the most part in this lesson, we'll be breaking images down by the principles of design as we analyze them, but this image does also introduce a little bit of conceptuality into our understanding of art. This is basically a portrait of his friend, a poet, William Carlos Williams. And more than being an image of his friend, this is basically taken from a poem of his where he's describing a fire truck as it's racing by in the rain, and the fire truck had a number 5 written in gold on it. So it's representative of the poem and of the man, but you don't really see an image of a physical human being in this. This is kind of the nature of some conceptual things in art. Now, before we go any further, we'll be looking mostly at the images in this lesson in the sense of their compositional elements and the way they're designed. So before we start breaking down an image and the way it's designed, there are a few definitions to go over. We've got a composition, which is the organization of visual elements in art; the design, which is the process of organizing visual elements; and the product of that process. To support all this, we have the principles of design, which are general guidelines for effective visual communication. Now, most artists do follow these rules that I'm about to explain to you, but for a lot of it, it's kind of subconscious and very natural in the way it happens. Once you learn it, you get a basic visual sense for things. So the first one we'll be going over later is unity and variety. Balance is next. Emphasis and subordination. Directional forces. Contrast. Repetition and rhythm. And scale and proportion. We're going to go back to the figure 5 in gold and discuss that image in the context of these matters. So we'll start breaking down this image compositionally by starting with unity and variety. The large 5 unifies the whole composition, and we have a few others in there as well. It's the most dominating element, so that's where unity comes from. There's also some variety in there. We have it in different tones and different sizes as well. Also, variety translates to the rest of the image when we have all sorts of different shapes interacting with each other. Although this is not a symmetrical image, it feels very well balanced by the placement of all the images and shapes and varieties of objects in here. It just makes visual sense. Next, when we look at emphasis and subordination, you can see that the 5 is emphasized, and the smaller little letters that are identifiable by the words Bill, Carlos, the WCW in the bottom, those are subordinates to the larger letter forms. The diagonal shapes that we have in this composition represent the falling raindrops, therefore giving us some directional forces. We've got contrast in this image from the reds and the blacks and the colors playing off of each other. Repetition is easy to identify purely because the 5s get repeated a lot in this image, and the rhythm can be contextualized by the 5 being inside of another 5 being inside of another 5. It's very logical, makes sense, in the same place basically, has a rhythm to it. And lastly, with scale and proportion, also obviously with the 5s being different sizes, that's our scale, the proportion, their relationship to each other. That's also a pretty logical conclusion. One thing to take note of is that there's always kind of a balance in another way with things, that too much unity leads to a kind of boring composition if you don't have enough variety to it. Too much variety, of course, leads to chaos. Balance is important, but it doesn't mean that your image has to be symmetrical. So keep these things in mind when you're looking at an image and breaking it down visually.
This image here is a sculpture by John McCracken titled Silver from 2006. It's made of polyester resin, fiberglass, and plywood. It's 93 inches long, 17 inches wide, and 3.5 inches thick, so to say. Now, when we look at this image in the context of unity and variety, it is a very unified composition by being this very stable, recognizable shape. Whether or not it has a lot of variety to it is up to the viewer and to the lighting conditions. Now, it does appear to be black due to the color, but when certain lighting conditions arise and it's lit a certain way, it does appear to be silver. That's usually due to the reflective qualities of the surface. Now, we'll be looking at a lot of different works, and you'll see different contexts of unified compositions and compositions with variety. They do have to kind of work hand in hand. If you have too much unity and not enough variety, it doesn't seem like the piece will really go much of anywhere. And also, if you have too much variety and not enough unity, the piece will come off as being chaotic and out of order and may not engage the viewer necessarily.
Our next image from Jacob Lawrence is Going Home from 1946. This is a prime example of what variety is. Variety does provide some diversity in image. It also prevents things from getting boring. Now remember, too much variety may lead to a little bit of chaos, but Jacob Lawrence certainly knew how to rein it in. You'll be seeing a lot of these. This is a line study of Going Home by Jacob Lawrence. This is probably an easier way of seeing how Lawrence broke his visual space down into a variety of different triangular shapes, being a really dominant trait of the image. One aspect of unity and variety working in harmony with each other is pattern, which is a repetitive ordering of design elements. In this painting of an interior of a Dutch house from 1658, we can see how there are patterns all over the place in here. We've got the interplay of the patterns, the checkerboard on the floor with the window panels on the left and the rectangles up on the top. It's very organized. We're going to look now at a line study and investigate a little bit further. So when looking at the line study, you can definitely see how this breaks down into more of a unified structure with all these different geometric shapes, mostly all squares. It's kind of nice how it unifies with the variety of the other type of square patterns, which are in the tiles and the window panes like we talked about before. But for a lot of us artists, this is kind of second nature, that we visually break down a space like this. But back in the old days, most artists probably made a study first. This is actually a newer version, but things were a little less random then, since they were a lot more academic, and we'll get into that a little bit later. This next image is from Robert Rauschenberg. It's Gift for Apollo from 1959. This is, in essence, unity and variety, completely in harmony with each other. We've got so many different objects in here. That's where we get our variety from. But everything's kind of tightly contained on the frame, therefore unified. They're also unified in their subject matter, that they're all found objects. This is a assemblage, which is kind of a mixture of painting and sculpture, a mixed media project. But assemblage is something that Robert Rauschenberg was very famous for it. This next image is from a sculptor named Alberto Giacometti. It's one of my favorites. This is Chariot from 1950. This is a crossover image because we do have unity through these simple shapes. It's very well balanced, which we're actually about to get to. We also have a variety within the different types of shapes that exist within here. Different geometric forms. We've got lines, circles, and squares. Now, if we look at our next section, which will be balance, this is what you would call a symmetrically balanced image. Now, we're going to be breaking that down even further next, but symmetrical means it basically has two equal sides to kind of stabilize things. In considering balance, we have two different types of balance that we'll be going over. First is symmetrical balance. Symmetrical balance is the near or exact matching of left and right sides of a three-dimensional form or a two-dimensional composition. As you can see in this design for the President's House from 1792 from James Hovind. That sketch eventually became what we know as the White House today. Here you see a symmetrically balanced three-dimensional object. The first one was the sketch, of course, so that's the two-dimensional composition. This next image by Damien Hirst, Posterity, The Holy Place from 2006, is also a prime example of symmetrical balance. This is almost perfect if you look very closely on each side divided on that center line. We have repetitions of each butterfly. There are some slight, tiny little variations within the way they are painted, but this is almost perfectly symmetrical. With this next image from Lavinia Fontana, we move to a different type of balance, which is asymmetrical balance. Asymmetrical balance is when the left and right sides are not equal. Since there is no dividing line in the center to balance objects on either side, the artist then cleverly wound up balancing the objects by having different size shapes of individuals, different tree sizes, and even the color of the sky in the background does balance off with the darker front colors behind our two front figures. To further explain some of the complexities behind asymmetrical balance, there's some principles about visual forms that we can look at. A large form is heavier, more attractive, or more attention-getting than a small form. Thus, two or more small forms can balance one large form. A form gathers visual weight as it nears the edge of a picture. In this way, a small form near an edge can balance a larger form near the center. And a complex form is heavier than a simple form. Thus, a small, complex form can balance a large, simple form. Now, when we introduce color into asymmetrical balance, color tends to complicate the form principles we just went over. So here are some color principles to counteract them. Warm colors are heavier than cool colors. A single small yellow form can therefore balance a large dark blue form. Related to the point above, warm colors tend to advance towards the viewer, while cool colors tend to recede. This means that when considering two small or similar forms of opposing temperature, the warmer will be visually heavier because it seems closer to the viewer. Intense colors are heavier than weak or pale colors, which are tints and shades. Hence, a single small, bright blue form near the center can balance a large, pale blue form near an edge. And lastly, the intensity and therefore the weight of any color increases as the background color approaches its complementary hue. Thus, on a green background, a simple red form can balance a large, complex blue form. Here we have an image from a master of asymmetrical balance. This is from Edgar Degas. This is Jockeys Before the Race. This is extremely asymmetrically balanced. It can come off as being a little strange because we have that strong pole slightly right of center with most of the characters kind of on the right. Those are our forms. What he does in this image is he balances it slightly with the forms, but also through a heavy use of color, which is typical of a impressionist artist. If we look at the line study of Jockeys Before the Race, we can really pick up on the other elements of the asymmetrical balance aside from the color. If we look at the strong line of the pole, and then how if you follow on an arc over the jockey's heads, it kind of brings your vision over to the left side, and then it again raises up to the top with the little balance of the sphere up on the top of the sun. Now, this may be a little unusual for y'all, but maybe once you start looking around, you're going to look at the way photographs are balanced now after taking some of these images apart, such as we have. And one last image before we move on to our next principle of design. This is a sculpture titled Declaration. This is a prime example also of a asymmetrically balanced object. The difference between this and some of the paintings we've been looking at is it is a sculpture, so it does have to have some type of structural balance for it to support itself. But as you look, everything's off kilter in here. There's a prime example of what an asymmetrically balanced object is. Hopefully now, with all the things we've gone over, this should be pretty familiar to you from here on out.
Our next category under the principles of design is emphasis and subordination. If there is a certain focal point, which is usually something figurative or an aspect of a work of art that would draw the viewer's attention, an artist may use emphasis to draw the eye towards that particular focal point. Subordination is usually used to subdue a background, to let a foreground object become emphasized in a work of art.
Directional forces is our next principle of design. Directional forces, like emphasis and subordination, help visually guide us through an image. This is Bullfight from Francisco Goya. We're going to now look at the line studies and break down this image in the several directional forces that it has. In this line study, we see a strong diagonal from the upper right-hand corner almost straight down to the left-hand corner. This creates a serious sense of action. We also, through the rod that the bullfighters kind of posed on, that's pointing down to the ground, the head of the bull, the arms of the bull, everything are kind of pointing to that emphasized point. When we look at this one, just emphasizes again yet those points that parallel themselves to the arms of the bull. And then when we look at this image, we have our stable triangle, but still it's asymmetrically balanced. It's off from the center. Another thing to make a point of when we look at this image is the action is also pushed up front by the de-emphasizing of the detail in the background of the characters in the audience. Our next principle of design is contrast, which is the juxtaposition of strongly dissimilar elements. Some examples of contrast would be dark against light, large against small, bright colors against dull colors. Another principle of design is repetition and rhythm. We've already seen it a few times in some of the images we've looked at already. Now, too much repetition can lead to boredom, but repetition in a successful image brings unity to your composition. This painting is by Lyubov Popova. This is The Pianist from 1915. And we can see rhythm and repetition all over the place in this image. Hopefully by now you're able to recognize some abstraction, but if you look closely, kind of a little bit above to the left of center, there's a little white block with some buttons on it that represents the white shirt. Now if you look to the right, slowly descending down, we have repeated representations of that in the sheets of music, that which leads rhythmically your eye to the piano keyboard below. He's also got his fingers, which show some type of movement by having the lines overlap like that. This is also similar to some of the images that we've looked at from Degas and Goya, where the eye is being led purposely by other objects in the composition. When we think of rhythm in the visual arts, it's not much different at all than it is with music. In the visual arts, rhythm is created through the regular occurrence of elements with related variations. As we can see here in Cranes from Ogata Karen, this is roughly from around 1700. Here we get repetition and rhythm from the birds, their bodies, their legs forming a pattern that is repeated with some variations. The last principle of design we'll be going over is scale and proportion. According to your text, scale is the size relationship of one thing to another, and proportion is the size relationship of parts to a whole. As we can see in this diagram, simple changes in scale and proportion can affect the way forms interact with each other. I don't know how many of you play badminton, but this is a gigantic sculpture of a shuttlecock, which is part of the badminton equipment. It's pretty similar to tennis. You have two rackets and a higher net, and you kind of bat the things back and forth. In this sculpture from Claes Oldenburg and Kusi van Bruggen, it completely affects us on the sense of scale. This is normally just about a 4-inch size object. It's been enlarged enormously to about 216 inches almost in size. Oldenburg is one of my favorite artists from the pop art movement. He's also a little bit different because he's a sculptor. Painting was pretty much the dominant feature of the pop art movement. Back when I was in graduate school, I worked at the Contemporary Art Center in New Orleans, and we did have a pop art show back in 1997, and I had the privilege of hanging a giant meatball and fork from Claes Oldenburg. It was really ridiculous because it took about 6 of us to hang this piece. The meatball was actually on the wall, and the fork supported it from the ground, but it weighed, I guess, about half a ton to a ton in size, and it must have looked really funny to all the observers as we were trying to hang this thing with pulleys, and it took all these men to hang a giant meatball on the wall. There you have a classic art experience. Hopefully some of y'all will get to stumble across a Claes Oldenburg piece if you go to a museum in the future. This is a marble sculpture by Michelangelo. This is a Pietà from 1501. The word pietà is Italian for pity, and it refers to a depiction of Mary holding and mourning the body of Jesus Christ. The pietà is a common subject in art history. Lucky for us, we only have 2 to look over, and we won't have to compare and remember all the artists for the others. Michelangelo often used optical illusions through playing with scale and proportion. We'll go even more into depth with it when we get to the Renaissance lesson. But this basically breaks down to, in order to visually support the immense size of an adult man's body on a woman's body, Michelangelo actually had to enlarge Mary in the image to be able to visually support the body of Christ. Now, she's masked in size a little bit by having all those drapes and her clothing around her, but she is very much larger than Jesus, even though he technically would have been the same size or larger than her. This was very common to use tricks like this in the Renaissance, optical effects to achieve a more successful result. We're now going to compare another Pietà. This is the Röntgen Pietà from about 200 years before Michelangelo's Pietà. Here you can tell the artist knew that he was dealing with 2 similarly sized subjects, but he had to kind of deal with the scale and proportion of each. It was easier, basically, to have a more emaciated looking Jesus Christ to balance out the body of Mary. Now, for sculptures as old as this, we kind of have to think and use our imagination a little bit and what we know about artists to determine what they may have been thinking possibly when they're arriving to certain conclusions in composing their work. Well, that summarizes our lesson on the principles of design. Try to remember that different artists work in different ways, and things most certainly have changed over time. For many artists, the design process goes through many different states, as we're going to look at right now from Henri Matisse. This is a state for the large reclining nude painting that he has. Matisse, like many artists, rearrange, reevaluate, and try to get the best composition they can out of a piece. At this next one, you see he's completely flattening out the space, playing with the shape of the body by actually putting little portions of paper, maybe to block out the painted form of the female body that's there. The proportions also went a little bit out of whack. So you can see he made some adjustments to balance things out. Not to say that this isn't a little bit out of proportion, but it makes a lot more visual sense. Once satisfied with his design, Matisse was able to finalize his large reclining nude. Here we have the final example from 1935, pretty similar to the last state that we just looked at. I can't say that all artists work this way. It was a very big tradition in the last century to do this. I must say, probably because of my modern tendencies of wanting to do things quickly. Myself as an artist, I kind of work things out in my mind first, and I may only go through 1 to 2 states. There are many artists that can go through 10, 12, 15 even, trying to get the best result possible. Now we're at the end of our lesson. To leave you with an image, this is a portrait of Henri Matisse by André Derain. I will leave you with a quote from Matisse. "What I dream of is an art of balance, of purity, and serenity, devoid of troubling or depressing subject matter, an art which might be for every mental worker, businessman, or writer, like an appeasing influence, like a mental soother, something like a good armchair in which to rest from physical fatigue." So, Matisse, as well as everybody, gets their own purposes out of art, and I hope you're slowly developing that yourselves.